The galaxy was ruled by fear, and the fear had a name. The Valdari Imperium controlled nearly half of all known space. They had burned worlds, crushed civilizations, and turned entire species into servants. At the center of it all sat Emperor Zorath Kale, on his throne of black metal, on a planet called Kael'thas Prime. He had lived for over 3,000 years, kept alive by machines woven into his flesh and bones. He had conquered more than 200 civilizations. He had never lost a war. He had never shown mercy. And he had never, not once, felt afraid. Humanity was a small thing in the eyes of the galaxy. They lived on the outer edge, in a modest cluster of star systems. They had no great fleets. They had no ancient technology. What they had was a strange stubbornness that made them difficult to crush. The Valdari War Council had studied them for decades and concluded that invading human space would cost more than it was worth. Humans fought in strange ways. They hid in asteroid fields. They used cheap, ugly ships packed with nuclear weapons. They sent tiny teams behind enemy lines to destroy supply chains. They refused to surrender, even when the numbers said they should. The War Council called them unprofitable and moved on to easier targets. But Zorath did not like leaving things unconquered. So when humanity sent a message requesting a peace summit, he accepted. Not because he wanted peace, but because he saw an opportunity. The human ship arrived at Kael'thas Prime on a cold morning. It was a single vessel, small and unarmed, painted white with the words HSS Olive Branch written on its hull. The Valdari Defense Fleet, which consisted of over 10,000 warships arranged in orbit like a wall of iron teeth, watched it drift through their formation. Several captains laughed at the sight. One described it as watching a mouse walk into a room full of cats. 12 were Marines in dress uniforms, standing tall and quiet. The 13th was their leader. Her name was Commander Sarah Voss. She stepped off the ship and onto the landing platform of the Imperial Palace, and the first thing she did was look up at the sky and smile. It was a simple, warm smile, the kind a person might wear when visiting a friend's home for the first time. The Valdari Honor Guard, standing in formation, did not know what to do with that smile. They were trained to respond to threats, to aggression, to submission. A smile was none of those things. Sarah was not tall. She was not physically impressive. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple knot, brown skin, and calm brown eyes. She wore a plain dark uniform with no medals and no decorations except a small silver pin on her collar, shaped like an olive branch. She walked with the easy, unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world. The Emperor received her in his throne room. It was a massive space, built to make visitors feel small. The ceiling was so high it disappeared into shadow. The walls were lined with the preserved banners of every civilization Zorath had conquered. He sat on his throne at the top of a long staircase, looking down at her like a god looking down at an insect. Sarah walked to the base of the stairs, looked up at him, and did something that shocked the entire court. She extended her hand. It was a human greeting, a handshake, and it required the other person to come down to her level. The court held its breath. No one had ever asked the Emperor to come to them. Zorath stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a kind laugh. He descended a few steps and gestured for one of his attendants to accept the handshake on his behalf. Sarah shook the attendant's hand cheerfully, as if this had been her plan all along. The negotiations began that afternoon. Sarah presented her terms, and they were surprisingly generous. Humanity asked for nothing except a mutual non-aggression treaty, open trade routes, and the release of a few dozen human prisoners taken during border skirmishes. She spoke clearly and simply. She made small jokes. She asked the Valdari delegates about their families. She complimented the food. She was, by every measure, the least threatening diplomat the Valdari had ever encountered. And yet, something was wrong. Small things. Things that most people did not notice, but that lingered in the mind like a half-remembered dream. The flowers in the vases on the negotiation table seemed to lean away from her, just slightly, as if pulled by a faint breeze that no one else could feel. A small insect that had been buzzing near a window went still and fell to the table the moment Sarah glanced in its direction. A young Valdari servant who brought her water said afterward that when their fingers touched during the handoff, she felt a cold so deep it reached her bones, though Sarah's skin had looked perfectly warm. And then there was the matter of Scribe Ilion. She was the Emperor's oldest advisor, a mystic who had served the throne for over 1,000 years. She was said to see the threads of fate that connected all living things. When Sarah's ship had first entered the system, Ilion had gone to the observation deck to watch its approach. She had stood there for a long time, saying nothing. Then she had returned to her quarters and locked the door. When Zorath sent a guard to summon her to the welcome ceremony, Ilion refused to come. The guard reported that she was sitting in the dark, trembling. When pressed, she had said only one thing. That woman has no thread in the loom. She is not woven into fate. She stands outside of it. The guard did not understand what this meant. Neither did Zorath when he was told. He dismissed it as the ramblings of a mystic who had lived too long. That evening, after the first round of negotiations, Zorath met with his inner circle in a sealed chamber deep within the palace. His top generals, his spymaster, and his war council gathered around a table made from the hull of the first ship Zorath had ever conquered. He told them his plan. The peace summit was a trap. Not humanity's trap, his. He would seize the human envoy as a hostage. He would execute her marine escort as a message. Then he would use the insult of humanity's weak delegation as a justification to launch a full invasion of human space. The galaxy would see that humanity had sent a single woman and 12 soldiers to negotiate for their survival, and the galaxy would understand that humanity was not worth saving. His generals nodded. His spymaster smiled. The plan was set. Zorath leaned back in his chair and said with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong, "They sent a single woman to bargain for their survival. Humanity is already dead. They just do not know it yet." Far away, in her guest quarters, Sarah Voss stood at a window and looked out at the stars. She was perfectly still. If anyone had been watching her closely, they might have noticed that her reflection in the glass did not quite match her movements. It was a half-second behind, as if the reflection belonged to someone else, something else, wearing her face. She whispered something to the night. It might have been an apology. Then she closed the curtains and went to sleep, and the stars outside her window seemed, just for a moment, to dim. The banquet was held on the third night. The great hall of the imperial palace was decorated with floating lanterns that cast golden light across walls made of polished black stone. Long tables were covered with food from 100 different worlds. Musicians played instruments that humans had no name for, filling the air with sounds that were beautiful and strange. It was the kind of event designed to show the full power and wealth of the Valdari Imperium, and it succeeded. Everything was grand, everything was perfect, and everything was a lie. Sarah Voss arrived in the same plain uniform she always wore. She had been offered Valdari formal clothing, robes of silk and precious metals, but she had politely refused. She walked into the hall with her 12 Marines behind her, and she smiled at everyone she passed, as if she were attending a neighborhood gathering back on Earth, and not a trap set by the most dangerous man in the galaxy. The evening moved slowly, and Sarah moved through it like water. She spoke to everyone. She asked a Valdari general about the scar on his face, and he found himself telling her the story before he could stop himself. She crouched down to speak to a Valdari child who had wandered into the hall, and the child laughed at something she said. She thanked every servant who brought her food or drink, looking each one in the eyes as she did. It was such a small, human thing to do, and it unsettled people in ways they could not explain. Things that settled into the minds of those who noticed them like stones sinking into dark water. The general who told her about his scar realized afterward that his hands had been shaking the entire time. He had fought in 37 wars. His hands had never shaken before. He did not understand why they shook now. A servant who refilled Sarah's glass noticed that the wine in the glass never seemed to decrease, no matter how many times she raised it to her lips. He told himself he was imagining it. He poured for her again anyway, and his hands shook too. The child who had laughed with her stopped laughing the moment Sarah walked away. Her mother found her standing very still, staring at nothing. When asked what the human lady had said, the child replied, "She said everyone gets to rest eventually." The mother did not know what to make of this. The child did not speak again for the rest of the night. And in a dark corner of the hall, an old insect, one of the decorative beetles that the Valdari kept as living ornaments, sat on a windowsill. It had been dying slowly for days. When Sarah passed the window, she paused and looked at it. Just a glance. The beetle went still. Its tiny legs curled inward, and it was gone. It was the most peaceful death anything had ever had, and no one saw it except Sarah, who moved on without a word. The signal came at the height of the feast. Zorath raised his glass and spoke a toast to peace between the Valdari and humanity. The hall cheered. Sarah raised her glass in return, and then the Emperor set his glass down, and his eyes went cold, and he gave a small nod to the shadows. The doors exploded inward. Valdari shock troops poured into the hall from every entrance, armored in black, carrying weapons that hummed with energy. They moved with the speed and precision of soldiers who had practiced this exact scenario many times. Sarah's 12 Marines reacted instantly. They formed a circle around her, drawing sidearms that looked like toys compared to the Valdari weapons. They knew they were going to die. Every single one of them knew it. But they had been chosen for this mission because they were the kind of people who would stand between their charge and an army without hesitation. And that is exactly what they did. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. The Marines fought with everything they had. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and surrounded, but they made the Valdari pay for every inch. A sergeant named Torres killed 6 shock troops before a plasma bolt took her legs. She kept firing from the floor until a second bolt found her chest. A corporal named Jin used his own body to shield Sarah from a grenade blast. A private named Okafor, the youngest of the group at only 22 years old, fought with a broken arm and a combat knife after his weapon was destroyed. He took down 2 more soldiers before they killed him. One by one, they fell. And as each one fell, Sarah did something that the watching Valdari would remember for the rest of their lives. She spoke their names. Not screaming, not crying. She said each name in a calm, clear voice, like she was reading from a list that only she could see. Sergeant Maria Torres, Corporal David Jin, Private Emeka Okafor. She named all 12 of them. And every Valdari soldier in the room noticed the same impossible thing. Each Marine, in the exact moment of death, stopped struggling. Their faces relaxed. The pain left their eyes. They looked in that final instant like people who had just been told that everything was going to be all right. Like people being welcomed home after a long journey. The last Marine to fall was Lieutenant Rowe, the squad leader. He had taken 4 wounds and was on his knees, bleeding out, his weapon empty. He looked up at Sarah, and she looked back at him. She said his name. Lieutenant James Rowe. And he smiled. He actually smiled. Then he closed his eyes and was gone. The hall was silent. The golden lanterns flickered. The music had stopped. Zorath descended from his elevated table and walked towards Sarah. His boots echoed on the blood-stained floor. He stepped over the bodies of her Marines without looking down. He was grinning. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment the insignificant species learned its place. He stood before her and spread his arms wide, as if presenting a gift. He told her that her Marines had died for nothing. He told her that her species would be next. He told her that every human world would burn, that every human would be put in chains, that the name humanity would be erased from the records of the galaxy. He spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had given this kind of speech many times before. Then he asked if she had any last words before she was thrown into the deepest dungeon beneath the palace. Sarah looked at him. Her face had not changed throughout the entire massacre. She had not cried, she had not screamed, she had not begged. She looked at the Emperor of the Valdari Imperium with the same calm, quiet expression she had worn since the moment she stepped off her ship. And then she spoke. "You have made a mistake, Emperor," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried through the silent hall with perfect clarity. Not a political one, not a military one, an ontological one. Zorath frowned. He did not understand the word. "You have killed in my presence," Sarah continued, "and you did not ask my permission." No one in the hall understood what she meant. A few of the courtiers exchanged confused glances. Zorath stared at her for a long moment, waiting for the rest, waiting for the begging, or the threats, or the desperate bargaining. But there was nothing else. Just that quiet sentence hanging in the air like smoke. Zorath laughed. It was a loud, sharp laugh that bounced off the walls. He waved his hand, and the shock troops seized Sarah by the arms and dragged her away. She did not resist. She walked with them as calmly as she had walked into the hall. They took her down, past the palace levels, past the military floors, past the prison blocks, all the way to the deepest cell beneath the mountain on which the palace stood. It was a place designed for people who were never meant to see light again. They threw her inside, sealed the door, and left her in complete darkness. For a long time, there was silence. Then the temperature in the cell began to drop. Not slowly, not naturally. It plummeted, like a stone thrown into an abyss. Frost crawled across the walls in patterns that looked almost like writing in a language older than any spoken tongue. The darkness in the cell became thicker, heavier, as if it had weight and substance. Sarah sat cross-legged on the cold floor. She was perfectly still. Her eyes opened, but they were not her eyes anymore. The brown was gone. In its place were two vast black voids, and inside those voids, stars were dying. Not twinkling, dying, collapsing in on themselves and going dark, one by one, like candles being snuffed out by an invisible hand. She spoke into the darkness. Her voice was still soft, still calm, but it resonated with something ancient and immense, something that had existed before the first atom formed, and would exist long after the last galaxy went cold. "I gave them a chance," she said. "I always give them a chance." Above her, in the banquet hall, the golden lanterns went out, all of them, at once, and in the sudden darkness, someone screamed. The empire of Zorath Kale had just made its final mistake, and the thing sitting in the cell beneath his palace was patient. It had been patient since the beginning of everything. The first deaths were quiet, and that was what made them so terrible. 3 days after the betrayal, a soldier aboard the Valdari flagship Ironclaw did not wake up. His bunkmate tried to shake him. His body was warm, His heart had simply stopped. The medical officer examined him and found nothing wrong. Every organ was healthy. Every system was functioning. There was no poison, no disease, no injury. The body was perfect in every way, except that it was dead. By the end of that first day, 47 more soldiers on the same ship had died in the same way. They went to sleep and did not wake up. Some of them died sitting in chairs. Some died standing at their posts, their bodies crumpling to the ground, mid-step, as if someone had reached inside them and turned off a switch. The medical teams worked without rest, running every test they knew, and they found nothing. The people inside them were simply gone. The flagship captain sent an urgent message to the Emperor. Zorath read it and dismissed it as a disease, probably something the humans had carried with them. He ordered quarantine procedures and told the fleet to continue its course toward human space. But it was not a disease. Diseases could be understood. Diseases followed rules. This followed no rules at all. On the fourth day, it reached Calthus Prime. It began in the palace. A cook in the royal kitchen put down her knife, walked to the nearest wall, and sat down. She did not move again. She was not dead. Her eyes were open. Her heart was beating, but she had stopped. When other staff tried to speak to her, she did not respond. When they shook her, she did not react. She sat there, staring at nothing, as if the part of her that was a person had quietly packed its bags and left. By the end of the week, hundreds of people across the palace had done the same thing. They simply stopped. They stopped eating. They stopped speaking. They stopped moving. They sat or stood wherever they were when it took them, and they stared at walls or floors or ceilings with empty eyes. The doctors called it catatonia. The mystics called it something worse. But the stopping was only the beginning. The gardens of the imperial palace were famous across the galaxy. They contained plants from 1,000 conquered worlds, tended by the finest botanists in existence. On the sixth day, every plant in the garden began to wilt. Not from lack of water or sunlight. The gardeners checked everything. The soil was rich. The plants were simply dying, all of them, as if the concept of growth itself had been withdrawn from the grounds of the palace. Animals were next. The hunting beasts in the Emperor's private reserve lay down in their enclosures and did not rise. They were not sick, they were not injured. They breathed, but they did not move. They looked at their handlers with dark, wet eyes full of something that might have been understanding, and they waited. On the 8th day, the birth rate on Calthus Prime dropped to 0. Not a single child was born. Not a single egg hatched. Not a single seed sprouted. The hospitals reported that pregnancies were continuing normally, but no labor began. No water broke. The babies were alive and healthy inside their mothers, but they would not come out. It was as if something had decided that no new life would enter this world. Not yet. Not until something had been settled. Zorath held an emergency council. His generals had no answers. His scientists had no explanations. His doctors had no cures. They argued and shouted and blamed each other, while the Emperor sat in his throne and felt, for the first time in 3,000 years, a sensation he did not recognize. It took him several minutes to identify it. It was helplessness. Then Scribe Ilian walked into the council chamber. She had not left her quarters since Sarah's arrival. She looked as if she had aged 100 years in a single week. Her hands trembled. Her eyes were red. But her voice, when she spoke, was steady. She told them the old stories, not the official histories of the Valdari. Older stories. Stories from before the Imperium, before the Valdari even had a civilization. Stories passed down through mystics and seers across 100 different species, all telling the same tale in different words. There was an entity, she said, that existed outside of fate. It was not a god. It was a function, a law, as fundamental as gravity or time. It was the thing that allowed life to end. Every death that had ever occurred, from the death of the first single-celled organism in the primordial waters of a forgotten world to the death of the greatest emperor in the galaxy, happened because this entity permitted it. It did not kill. It simply opened the door, and the dying walked through. And sometimes, she said, it wore a face. It chose a species, a people, and it walked among them. It did this not out of cruelty or curiosity, but out of something that the old stories could not quite name. The closest word in any language was love. It chose humanity, Ilian said. I do not know why. Perhaps because they are the only species that does not run from it. They build rituals around it. They hold the hands of the dying. They weep, and then they celebrate the life that was lived. They carry their dead with them, in memory, in story, in love. They made peace with the one thing that every other civilization in the galaxy has spent its entire existence trying to defeat. The council chamber was silent. And you, Ilian said, turning to the Emperor, imprisoned it. You killed in its presence without respect. You treated death as your weapon, your tool, your servant. And now it has remembered that it serves no one. Zorath slammed his fist on the arm of his throne. He called her a fool. He called her a relic. He said that no fairy tale was going to explain a simple plague, and he ordered his guards to go to Sarah's cell and execute her immediately. If she was somehow responsible, killing her would end it. If she was not, then she was useless anyway. The guards went, 2 of them, armed with energy weapons capable of cutting through starship armor. They descended into the deepest level of the palace, opened the sealed door of her cell, and stepped inside. Their breath came out in white clouds. The walls were covered in frost, so thick it looked like fur. And growing from the cracks in the floor were flowers. Black flowers, with petals that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They grew without soil, without water, without sun. They grew because she was there. Sarah sat in the center of the cell, exactly where they had left her. Her eyes were closed. Her hands rested on her knees. She looked like a woman meditating, calm and still, and unbothered by the cold that was turning the guards' fingers blue inside their gloves. The first guard raised his weapon. His commander had given the order. He was a soldier. He followed orders. He aimed at her neck and fired. The energy blade passed through her, not around her, through her, as if she were not solid, as if she were made of smoke, or shadow, or memory. The blade hit the wall behind her, and left a glowing scar in the stone. She did not open her eyes. The guard fired again, and again. Each shot passed through her, as if she were not there. Then she opened her eyes. They were black. Not dark brown, not deep gray. Black, the way space is black, between the stars. And inside that blackness, things moved. Faint, distant lights that flickered and died. The guard looked into those eyes, and he understood, in a single, terrible instant, exactly what was sitting in front of him. It was not a prisoner. It was not a woman. It was the thing that had been waiting at the end of every life since the beginning of time. It was the last face that every living thing would ever see. He did not scream. He did not have time. His body aged. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once. 50 years of time compressed into 5 seconds. His skin wrinkled. His hair went white and fell out. His bones turned brittle. His eyes clouded. He collapsed into a pile of dust inside his armor. The armor hit the floor with a hollow clang. The second guard ran. He made it to the hallway before his legs gave out. He crawled the rest of the way to the elevator, weeping and babbling. When the other soldiers found him, he could only say one thing, over and over. She looked at me. She looked at me. She looked at me. He died that night in his bed, with his eyes wide open and an expression on his face that the palace doctors could only describe as absolute, primordial terror. The report reached Zorath within the hour. He read it in his private chamber, alone, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the Emperor of the Valdari Imperium felt afraid. Far away, at the border of human space, the Valdari invasion fleet drifted in silence. Ship after ship had gone dark. Their engines still hummed, their lights still glowed, but no one answered when command sent signals. When scout vessels were sent to investigate, they found the crews dead at their stations, their faces peaceful, their bodies untouched. Hundreds of warships, tens of thousands of soldiers, all gone, quietly, like candles blown out by a breath from somewhere vast and dark and patient. Human border stations recorded the fleet's approach, then recorded its stopping, then recorded the silence. They did not understand what they were seeing. They only knew that the largest invasion fleet ever assembled was now the largest graveyard in space. And beneath the palace, in the frozen dark, Sarah closed her eyes again. The black flowers at her feet grew another inch. She was patient. The Empire was dying, and it was dying wrong. That was the part that broke people. Death had always been a part of life in the Valdari Imperium. Soldiers died in battle. The old died in their beds. The sick faded away. It was natural. It was understood. It was, in its own harsh way, fair. But what was happening now was none of those things. The old and sick could not die. They wanted to. They begged for it. Elders who had lived full lives and were ready to rest found themselves trapped in failing bodies that would not stop. Their pain grew worse. Their minds grew cloudy. But the end would not come. They lay in hospital beds and wept, reaching for a door that had been locked shut. The young and healthy died without warning. A child playing in a courtyard would simply fall. A soldier in perfect condition would drop mid-sentence. A mother holding her baby would close her eyes for just a moment and never open them again. There was no pattern. There was no logic. The only pattern was that there was no pattern. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Death had stopped being a natural law. It had become a judgment. Across the wider Imperium, the conquered species began to stir. The Valdari had held 200 civilizations under their boot for centuries, but those boots were now filled with dust. Garrisons stopped reporting in. Governors went silent. On a dozen worlds, the oppressed looked around and realized that their oppressors were simply gone. Not defeated, not driven out, just gone. They walked out of their homes and into empty streets and looked at each other and did not know what to do with the freedom that had arrived without a single shot being fired. News traveled across the galaxy at the speed of light and the speed of rumor, and both carried the same message. Something had happened to the Valdari Imperium, something that no one could explain. The most powerful civilization in known space was crumbling, and no enemy had attacked it. No fleet had challenged it. No rebellion had risen against it. It was simply falling apart, like a body whose soul had departed, but whose muscles had not yet received the news. And through all of this, on Calthis Prime, Emperor Zorath Kal sat in his palace and felt his own body betraying him. His cybernetics were failing. The machines that had kept him alive for 3,000 years were shutting down, one system at a time. First the pain suppressors, then the organ regulators, then the neural enhancers that kept his mind sharp and fast. For the first time in millennia, he felt the full weight of his own age pressing down on him like a mountain being lowered onto his chest. His joints ached, his vision blurred, his hands, which had signed the death warrants of billions, trembled like leaves in a wind. He did not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. Sarah's face in the banquet hall, calm and unchanged, as 12 Marines died around her, He heard her voice saying those 12 names. He heard her final words to him. An ontological mistake. He still did not fully understand what she had meant. But he was beginning to. On the 14th day, he went down to her cell. He went alone. He told no one. He took no guards, because he had seen what happened to the last guards he sent. He descended through the levels of the palace, each one colder than the last, until he reached the deepest point. The walls here were coated in frost, so thick it looked like white fur. His breath came in sharp, painful gasps, and the flowers were everywhere. Black flowers, growing from the stone, from the ceiling, from the floor, their petals soft and dark as velvet. They turned toward him as he passed, the way sunflowers turn toward the sun, except these turned toward something else entirely. He opened the cell door. Sarah was sitting exactly where she had been 2 weeks ago. She had not moved. She had not eaten. She had not slept. She looked exactly the same as the day she had arrived, calm and still and untouched by time, while the world above her rotted. The cell was beautiful in a terrible way. The frost on the walls had formed patterns, spirals and curves that looked almost like writing. The black flowers covered the floor in a carpet of dark petals. And in the center of it all, Sarah sat with her hands on her knees, her eyes closed, her face peaceful. She opened her eyes when he entered. They were brown again, human, warm. She looked at him the way a doctor might look at a patient who had waited too long to seek help. "Sit down." There was nowhere to sit except the frozen floor, so Zorath, the ruler of half the galaxy, lowered himself to the ground like a supplicant. His old bones screamed in protest. He did not care. "What are you?" he asked. His voice was hoarse. He had been screaming at his advisors for days, and it had accomplished nothing. "You know what I am," Sarah said. "Ilian told you. You chose not to believe her. Tell me yourself." Sarah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle, almost kind, and that kindness was somehow worse than any threat. "I am the end," she said. "I am what waits at the finish of every story. I am the last breath, and the closed eyes, and the still heart. I have been here since before the first star lit up the dark, and I will be here long after the last one goes cold. I am not cruel, I am not kind, I simply am." Zorath stared at her. "Why do you look human?" "Because I chose to," Sarah said. "I have worn many faces over the ages. I have walked among many species. But humanity is different." "How?" Sarah smiled. It was the same warm, simple smile she had worn when she first stepped off her ship. And Zorath realized with a chill that it had never been a mask. It was real. The thing sitting in front of him, the most terrible force in existence, was genuinely fond of the faced war. "Every species in this galaxy runs from me," she said. "They build empires to outrun me. They invent machines to cheat me. They wage wars to pretend they control me. They do everything they can to avoid the simple truth that I am coming for them, and there is nothing they can do to stop it." She paused. "Except humanity. They do not run. They do not hide. They do not pretend. When someone they love is dying, they sit beside the bed. They hold the hand. They say, 'I am here. I am here, and you are not alone.' They build entire rituals around me, funerals and memorials and wakes. They cry, and then they tell stories about the person who is gone, and they laugh through their tears. They carry their dead with them, not as a burden, but as a treasure. They are the only species in the universe that looked at me and said, 'You are not the enemy. You are part of the story.'" Her eyes glistened, not with the black void, with real tears, human tears. "So I walked among them," she whispered, "and I loved them. Not the way I love all living things, which is the love of a function performing its duty. I loved them the way they love each other, with grief and joy and terrible, beautiful aching, and I came here, wearing their face, to offer you what they would have offered you. Peace, a natural end when your time came, a good death." She looked at him, and her expression hardened, just slightly. And you killed 12 of them in front of me. 12 people who I had walked among, who I had watched grow from children into soldiers, who I had planned to welcome home gently when their time came. You killed them to make a point. You killed them to prove that you were powerful. You used death as a tool, as a toy, as a message. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I am no one's tool, Emperor. Zorath could not speak. His mouth moved, but no words came. The cold in the cell had reached his core, and he felt it in his chest, in his heart, in the place where whatever was left of his humanity still flickered. What do you want? He finally managed. Surrender, Sarah said. Not to me, to them, to the species whose face I wear, publicly, completely. Confess what you did. Release every species you have conquered. Dismantle your war machine, and then I will restore the natural order. Your people will live and die as they were meant to. The pain will stop. His fists clenched on his knees. He could feel the offer hanging in the air between them, and he could feel the weight of it. Everything he had built, everything he had conquered, everything he had spent 3,000 years creating. She was asking him to give it all up, to kneel before a species he had dismissed as insects, to admit, in front of the entire galaxy, that he had been wrong. His pride rose up in him like a wall. It was the same pride that had driven him to conquer his first world, his first system, his first galaxy. It was the thing that had made him great, and it was the thing that would not let him bend, not even now, not even in the face of something older than the stars. No, he said. Sarah looked at him for a long time. There was no anger in her face. There was only sadness. A deep, ancient sadness that stretched back to the first death and forward to the last. Then I will wait, she said. I am very patient, Emperor. I have been patient since the first star died. I can be patient a little longer. Zorath climbed to his feet. His legs shook. His vision swam. He turned and walked toward the door, and with every step he felt heavier, as if the gravity of the planet had doubled. He did not look back. Behind him, Sarah closed her eyes. Above him, as he climbed the stairs back to his palace, the lights went out. One by one, level by level, the palace went dark. Not a power failure, not a malfunction. The lights simply stopped. As if the concept of light, the idea that darkness could be pushed back, had been quietly withdrawn from the building. Zorath walked through the darkness, alone, and he felt, for the first time, like a man walking through his own grave. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy did not understand. Every intelligence agency, every diplomatic corps, every military command across known space turned its attention to the Valdari Imperium, and none of them could explain what they were seeing. The most powerful civilization in existence was collapsing, and there was no cause. No invasion fleet, no rebellion, no plague that scanners could detect. The Valdari were simply coming apart, like a building whose foundation had been quietly removed while everyone inside was sleeping. The questions spread through diplomatic channels and intelligence briefings and late-night conversations between worried heads of state. What was happening? How was it happening? And the question that kept everyone awake at night: what did humanity send to that summit? Because the humans knew something, they had to. They had sent a single unarmed ship to the throne world of the most dangerous empire in the galaxy. And now that empire was dying. The math did not add up. The logic did not hold. And yet, there it was. On Kael'thas Prime, the final weeks of the Valdari Imperium played out like a slow, quiet funeral. The palace was dark. The streets were empty. The military was gone, its soldiers either dead or sitting in silence in their barracks, staring at walls. The grand machine of conquest that Zorath Kale had built over 3,000 years had ground to a halt, not with a crash, but with a whisper. The conquered species did not need to fight for their freedom. They simply walked into it. On world after world, the Valdari garrisons had gone silent. The warships in orbit had gone dark. The governors had stopped giving orders. The chains had not been broken. Former subjects stepped out of their homes and found that the empire that had ruled them for centuries had become a ghost, present in name but absent in every way that mattered. Some of these species were angry. Some wanted revenge. They had suffered for generations under Valdari rule, and now their oppressors lay helpless. But something strange happened. On planet after planet, the freed species looked at the broken, empty-eyed Valdari who remained, and felt not rage, but pity. There was nothing satisfying about destroying something that had already destroyed itself. There was no victory in kicking a corpse. And then the humans arrived. Not a war fleet, not an invasion force, a diplomatic convoy, modest in size, carrying ambassadors and doctors and counselors and cargo holds full of medical supplies and food. They came not as conquistadors, but as neighbors. They docked at Kael'thas Prime's orbital stations without firing a shot, because there was no one left to fire at them. They landed shuttles on the surface and set up aid stations in the shadow of the Imperial Palace. The galaxy watched this too, and the galaxy was baffled. Humanity, the species that the Valdari had tried to destroy, was bringing aid to the people who had murdered their marines and imprisoned their envoy. Human doctors treated Valdari patients. Human counselors sat with Valdari civilians who had been catatonic for weeks, speaking softly to them, holding their hands, trying to bring them back. Human engineers worked to restore power and water to city districts that had gone dark. A reporter from one of the galactic news networks asked a human aid worker why they were helping the people who had tried to kill them. The aid worker, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and steady hands, looked at the reporter and said, "Because they are suffering." That is enough of a reason. The reporter did not know what to say to that. Zorath Kale watched it all from his throne room. He had not left it in days. His cybernetics had failed completely now, and he sat in his chair as a mortal man for the first time in millennia. He could feel his own heartbeat, weak and irregular, thumping in his chest like a small fist knocking on a door. He could feel the ache in his joints, the blur in his vision, the heaviness of his own body. He was old. He was so very old, and he had spent 3,000 years hiding from that fact, behind machines and conquest. And now there was nowhere left to hide. He could see the human shuttles from his window. He could see the white tents of the aid stations. He could see tiny figures in human uniforms moving among his people. And he could see his people accepting the help, because they had no one else to turn to. His generals were gone. Scribe Ilian had died 3 days ago, peacefully, in her sleep, with a faint smile on her face, as if she had been the only one granted the mercy of a natural end. On the 21st day, Zorath Kale made his decision. He ordered the palace communication systems activated. The technicians who remained worked for hours to bring them online. When the system was ready, Zorath sat before the broadcast array, and he opened a channel to every frequency in the galaxy. Every world, every station, every ship, every screen. He looked into the camera, and the galaxy saw what he had become. Not the gleaming cybernetic conqueror who had terrified civilizations for 3,000 years. An old man, a broken man, a man whose pride had cost him everything, and who had finally run out of ways to pretend that he was not the architect of his own destruction. He spoke. He confessed everything. The peace summit that was always a trap. The murder of 12 unarmed Marines. The imprisonment of the Envoy. The planned invasion. He spoke their names, the names of the 12 Marines, reading them from a list, because he had gone back and found out what they were. Torres, Jin, Okafor, Ro, all 12. His voice cracked on the last name, and he paused, and the galaxy watched him struggle with something it had never seen on his face before: shame. He renounced his title. He dissolved the Imperium. He released every conquered species from every obligation, every treaty, every chain. He surrendered, unconditionally and completely, to humanity. Then he turned off the broadcast, and he sat in the silence of his empty throne room, and he waited. Deep beneath the palace, something changed. The frost began to melt. It dripped from the walls in slow rivulets, flowing across the floor in tiny streams. The black flowers shivered, and as the water touched their petals, they changed. The blackness faded. The petals lightened, shifting through shades of gray, then silver, then white. The cell, which had been a tomb of ice and darkness for 3 weeks, filled with the faint, warm glow of the white flowers. And it looked, for just a moment, like a garden after a long winter. Sarah Voss opened her eyes. They were brown, warm, human. She unfolded her legs, placed her hands on the floor, and stood. She took a breath, the first visible breath she had taken since she had been placed in the cell, and she walked to the door. It was not locked. It had never been locked, not really. She pushed it open and stepped into the corridor. She walked up through the palace, level by level, step by step, the same path the guards had dragged her down 3 weeks ago. And as she walked, the world healed behind her. The lights came back on, not all at once, but gently, like a sunrise. On each level, the darkness receded as she passed, replaced by a warm, steady glow. In the hospital wing, the old and sick who had been trapped in their suffering finally closed their eyes and breathed out for the last time. And the expressions on their faces were peaceful, relieved, grateful. In the barracks, the catatonic soldiers blinked, looked around, and began to weep, because they were alive, and they could feel it again. In the birthing ward, a mother gasped, and a baby cried for the first time, and the nurses wept too, because that sound, the sound of new life, had been absent for so long that they had forgotten how beautiful it was. She passed through the throne room. Zorath was there, in his chair, staring at the floor. She did not stop. She did not speak to him. But as she passed, his cybernetics gave a final shudder and went permanently dark. Every machine in his body died, and in the silence that followed, he heard it, his own heartbeat, real, unassisted, mortal, the heartbeat of an old, old man who would, someday, die. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. And for the first time in 3,000 years, that knowledge did not fill him with terror. It filled him with something he did not have a name for, something that might have been relief or acceptance, or the faintest, most fragile beginning of peace. Sarah walked out of the palace and into the sunlight. It was a beautiful morning on Calthus Prime. The sky was clear. The air was warm. The white flowers from her cell had spread somehow, growing in small clusters along the path from the palace door to the landing zone where the human shuttles waited. A young Marine was standing at the foot of the shuttle ramp. He was new, barely 20, and he had been told only that they were here to pick up a very important person. He saw Sarah walking toward him, a woman in a rumpled uniform with dark hair and calm brown eyes, and he snapped to attention and saluted. She looked at his young face, his straight back, his eyes full of the particular kind of courage that belongs to people who have not yet learned what the galaxy can do to them. She saw, as she always saw, the thread of his life stretching out before him, bright and warm and finite, and she felt the familiar ache that she had learned from the species whose face she wore. The love that exists only because it ends, the beauty that is beautiful only because it does not last. She smiled, a real smile, a human smile. "Take me home," she said. The shuttle lifted off. Caelthus Prime shrank below them. The orbital defense platforms, once the most feared weapons in the galaxy, drifted silent and empty, monuments to an empire that had learned, too late, what every human child learns in their first years of life, that death is not the enemy, and it never was. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. Humanity rose, not as conquerors, but as something the galaxy had never seen before, a species that the rest of the universe actually trusted. Not because they were the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced, because they were the species that had shown up to help their enemies. Because they were the species that sent grief counselors before they sent soldiers. Because they were the species that had looked at the most fundamental terror of existence and said, "Sit down. We will get through this together." No one ever confirmed what had happened on Caelthus Prime. The official record said only that the Valdari Imperium collapsed due to internal instability and that humanity brokered the peace. But the unofficial stories, the ones told in whispers and late-night conversations and the quiet corners of space stations, told a different tale. Decades later, a Valdari historian named Torek published a book about the fall of the Imperium. It was dismissed by many as myth, but the final passage was quoted across the galaxy for generations, because it contained a story that no one could argue with. Torek wrote that he had spent years trying to understand why death, if the stories were true, had chosen to wear a human face. He had consulted philosophers and priests and scientists from 100 species. None of them could give him a satisfying answer. Then, on a visit to Earth, he had met a human child. She was 7 years old, sitting on a bench outside a hospital where her grandmother had just died. Torek, driven by the question that had consumed his life, sat down beside her and asked, gently, if she was afraid of death. The child looked at him with the honest, uncomplicated eyes that only children have, and she said, "Why would I be afraid? She is nice. She holds your hand, so you are not alone." Torek wrote that he had searched the galaxy for the answer to his question, and a 7-year-old human had given it to him in a single sentence. He had no rebuttal. He wrote that the galaxy still did not. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces between the stars, where the light does not reach and the silence is absolute, a woman with brown eyes and a warm smile walked among the living and the dying, and she held their hands, and she told them that it was all right, that it was time, that they were not alone. She had many names, in many languages, on many worlds, but the name she liked best was the one the humans had given her. Not a name of fear or worship or denial, but a simple, honest word spoken by a species that had looked at the end of all things, and seen not an enemy, but a friend. They called her rest. They called her peace. They called her the last kindness, and she loved them for it. She always had.